That which does not kill us makes us stronger. Live dangerously. Friedrich Nietzsche was a 19th century German philosopher famous for his worship of human potential and for encouraging individuals to seek great heights and make real their creative dreams. He's also famous for his absolute loathing of all things small, cowardly, mediocre. In his writings, we find a corresponding reverence for all things noble, great, heroic. He spoke directly and passionately to the best within each of us. Do not throw away the hero in your soul. Hold holy your highest hope. And for those of us who feel we have a creative spark that must be honored and nurtured, the noble soul has reverence for itself. One indication of the importance of Nietzsche is the pantheon of major 20th century intellectuals whom he influenced. He was an influence on Jean-Paul Sartre and Hermann Hesse, both of whom won Nobel Prizes for literature. He was an influence on thinkers as diverse in their outlooks as Ayn Rand and Michel Foucault. Rand's politics are classically liberal or broadly libertarian, while Foucault's are far left, including a stint in the French Communist Party. There's the striking fact that Nietzsche was an atheist, but he was an influence on Martin Buber, one of the 20th century's most widely read theologians. And while Nietzsche had harsh things to say about the Jews, as we will see, he was nonetheless admired by Chaim Weizmann, a leader of the Zionist movement and first president of Israel. So what is the attraction of Nietzsche? There is the exciting, sometimes scorching prose. Nietzsche was a stylist par excellence. There is the romanticism of life as a great, daring adventure. And of importance to intellectuals, there is the fundamentality and sheer audacity of some of the questions he raises about the human condition. According to his teachers and professors, the young Friedrich Nietzsche showed extraordinary intellectual promise. He was appointed professor at the University of Basel in Switzerland at the age of 24, which is unusually young for a professor. Even more unusually, he was appointed professor without having finished his doctoral degree, which was almost unheard of. As brilliant as Nietzsche was, though, he was not suited for academic life. By all accounts, he was a terrible lecturer, and he suffered from chronic health problems, which contributed to a general nervous collapse in 1870. From the mid-1870s on, he wandered about Europe alone and mostly lonely, surveying the cultural landscape. And when we take stock of the world in the late 19th century, what do we learn? God is dead. For thousands of years we have believed in religion, but in the modern world, religion has become a shadow of its former self. Nietzsche's dramatic phrase, God is dead, is meant to capture the shocking and personal quality of this revelation. For those of us raised religiously, religion personalized the world. It gave us the sense that the universe had a purpose, that we were part of a larger plan. It gave us the comfort that, despite appearances, we were all equal and cared for, and that upon death, instead of a cold grave, the possibility of a happily ever after ending awaits us. But we find it hard to believe that anymore. In the modern world, we have seen the dramatic rise of science, providing different, less comfortable answers to the questions that religion traditionally had a monopoly on. We have thrown off the shackles of feudalism with its unquestioning acceptance of authority and knowing our place. We're more individualistic and naturalistic in our thinking. But in historical time, all of this has happened very quickly in the span of a few centuries. For millennia, we believed in religion. But come the 19th century, even the average man has heard that religion may have reached the end of its road. For most of us, even the suggestion of this hints at a crisis. Imagine a 13-year-old who is awakened in the middle of the night to be told by strangers that both his parents have died. He is suddenly an orphan. For as long as he can remember, his parents have been presences in his life, looking after him and guiding him, sometimes firmly, but always a benevolent protection against a world he is not yet ready to handle on his own. Now they are gone, and ready or not, he is thrust into that world alone. How does the young teen handle that transition? Culturally, Nietzsche says, we are like that young teenager. For as long as we can remember, our society has relied upon God the Father to look after us, to be a benevolent and sometimes stern guiding force through a difficult world. But suddenly we are orphaned. We wake up one morning to discover in our heart of hearts that our naively childhood religious beliefs have withered. So now, whether we like it or not, a question creeps into our minds. How do we face the prospect of a world without God or religion? Well, says Nietzsche, in the 19th century, most of us do not face that question well. Most people avoid the issue, sensing that even to raise it would be to enter dangerous territory. They sense that the game is up for religion, but out of fear, they shut down their minds and will themselves to believe that God is still out there somewhere. Life without religion is too scary to contemplate, so they retreat to a safety zone of belief and repeat nervously the formulas they have learned about faith. Now, it is one thing, Nietzsche says, for a medieval peasant to have a simple-minded faith. But for us moderns, such a faith has a tinge of dishonesty about it. Slightly better to Nietzsche, but not much, are the socialists of the 19th century. Socialism is on the rise, and many socialists have thrown off the religion of their childhood, but only halfway. Most socialists will accept that God is dead, but then they are very concerned that the state take God's place and look after them. The mighty state will provide for us and tell us what to do and protect us against the mean people of the world. Think of it this way. The Judeo-Christian tradition says that this is a world of sin, in which the weak suffer at the hands of the strong, that we should all be selfless and serve God and others, especially the sick and the helpless, and that in a future ideal world, heaven, the lion will lay down with the lamb, and the inescapable power of God will bring salvation to the weak and judgment to the wicked. The Marxist socialist tradition says that this is a world of evil exploitation in which the strong take advantage of the weak, but that we should all be selfless and serve others, especially the needy, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, and that the forces of history will necessarily bring about a future ideal world, eliminating all harsh competition, empowering the oppressed, and eliminating the evil exploiters. Both religion and socialism thus glorify weakness and need. Both recoil from the world as it actually is, tough, unequal, harsh. Both flee to an imaginary future realm where they can feel safe. Both say to you, be a nice boy, be a good little girl, share, feel sorry for the little people. And both desperately seek someone to look after them, whether it be God or the state. But where, asks Nietzsche, are the men of courage? Who is willing to stare into the abyss? Who can stand alone on an icy mountaintop? Who is willing to look a tiger in the eye without flinching? Such men exist. Every generation produces its occasional magnificent men, sparkling, vital men who accept easily that life is tough, unequal, unfair, and who welcome asserting their strength to meet the challenge. Those who have unbending wills against anything the world can throw at them. But such magnificent men are few and far between in the 19th century, and Nietzsche wonders why. And he looks back on past cultures where the magnificent men dominated. Strength was prized and inequality was a fact of life. Assertiveness and conquest were sources of pride. He names the Japanese feudal nobility as an example, with their samurai code of honor. The Indian Brahmins who rose up and imposed their caste system. The Vikings who raided ruthlessly up and down the European coast. The expansionist Arabs, and of course, the awesome Roman Empire. What explains this stark contrast? Why do some cultures rise to greatness and unabashedly impose their will upon the world, while other cultures seem apologetic and urge upon us a bland conformity? Part of the answer, says Nietzsche, is biological. All of organic nature is divided into two broad species types, those who are by nature herd animals and those who are by nature loners. Some animals are naturally prey and others are predators. Some are born to be sheep, field mice, or cows, while other animals are born wolves, hawks, or lions. Psychologically and physically, this line runs through the human species as well. Some of us are born fearful and inclined to join the herd, while others of us are born fearless and inclined to seek great lonely heights. Some of us are born sedentary and more sluggish, while others are born crackling with purpose and craving adventure. Some of us, to use Nietzsche's language, are born slaves, and others are born to be masters. And which type you are, well, there's very little you can do about it. There's a brute biological fact here, Nietzsche believes. All of us are the product of a long evolutionary line, and our traits are bred into us evolutionarily. Just as a sheep cannot help but be sheepish, and a hawk cannot help but be hawkish, each of us inherits from our parents and from their parents before them a long line of inbuilt traits. It cannot be effaced from a man's soul what his ancestors have preferably and most constantly done. The master types live by strength, creativity, independence, assertiveness, and related traits. They respect power, courage, boldness, risk-taking, even recklessness. It's natural for them to follow their own path no matter what, to rebel against social pressure and conformity. The slave types live in conformity. They tend to passivity, dependence, meekness. It is natural for them to stick together for a sense of security, just as herd animals do. Now, says Nietzsche, let's talk about morality, about good and bad, right and wrong. For thousands of years, we've been taught that morality is a matter of religious commandments set in stone thousands of years ago. Not so, says Nietzsche. What we take to be moral depends on our biological natures, and different biological natures dictate different moral codes. Think of it this way. If you're a sheep, then what will seem good to you as a sheep? Well, being able to graze peacefully, sticking close together with others just like you, being part of the herd and not straying off. And what will seem bad to you? Well, wolves will seem bad, and anything wolf-like, predatory, or aggressive. But what if you're a wolf? Then strength, viciousness, and contempt for sheep will no doubt feel natural to you and good. There is nothing that the wolves and the sheep can agree upon morally. Their natures are different, as are their needs and their goals, as is what feels good to them. Of course, it would be good for the sheep if they could convince the wolves to be more sheep-like, but no self-respecting wolf is going to fall for that. That lambs dislike great birds of prey does not seem strange, only it gives no grounds for reproaching these birds of prey for bearing off little lambs. And if the lambs say among themselves, "These birds of prey are evil, and whoever is least like a bird of prey, but rather its opposite, a lamb, would he not be good?" There is no reason to find fault with this institution of an ideal, except perhaps that the birds of prey might view it a little ironically and say, "Oh, we don't dislike them at all, these good little lambs. We even love them. Nothing is more tasty than a tender lamb." The same point holds for humans. The divide between the strong and the weak, the assertive and the timid, runs right through the human species. So, says Nietzsche, the key question to ask about morality is not, is such and such a moral code universally and intrinsically good? Rather, the key question is, to what kind of person does such a moral code seem good? One's moral code is a decisive witness to who he is, to the innermost drives of his nature. Moral judgments, Nietzsche says, are symptoms and sign languages which betray the process of physiological prosperity or failure. So, one's moral code is a function of one's psychological makeup, and one's psychological makeup is a function of one's underlying biological makeup. The biological language and examples in the above quotations show that biology is central to Nietzsche's thinking about morality. Nietzsche was a precocious 15 years old when Charles Darwin's book On the Origin of Species was published in 1859. Of course, evolutionary ideas had been in the air a long time before Darwin, and much of the intellectual world was moving away from thinking about reality in terms of timeless, unchanging absolutes, and more toward thinking of reality in terms of process and change. And this applies to morality too. Moral codes, Nietzsche is suggesting, are part of a biological type's survival strategy. And the more you look at the history of morality evolutionarily and biologically, the more you are struck by the diversity of circumstances and how beliefs about moral codes have varied dramatically across time. And this is our key problem culturally, Nietzsche believes. The evidence shows that we used to prize excellence, strength, and power, and to look down upon the weak, the lowly, and the humble.
Now it's the humble, the common man, and the kindly neighbor who are the good guys, while the strong, the powerful, the excellent, the proud are evil. Think of it this way. Suppose I gave you the following list of traits and urged them upon you positively. It is good to be proud of yourself, to have a healthy sense of self-esteem. Wealth is good, for it gives you the power to live as you wish. Be ambitious and bold, and seek your highest dream. Don't take any garbage from people. Make it clear that you will take vengeance and exact justice against those who mess with you. Seek to improve your life and devote yourself only to those things that will profit you. Don't waste your time or resources. Seek great challenges, great pleasures, including sensual pleasures of the body, and go your own independent way in life, embracing whatever risks you must take in order to develop a full and realized sense of yourself as an individual. And when you have accomplished something great, admire yourself for what you have done and indulge yourself in the rewards that greatness deserves. Now consider the elements of this list together in a package. Does that list resonate with you? Do you think that if people lived according to this list of traits, that they would lead fuller, more active lives, and that they and the human species would reach its highest potential? Now consider a different set of traits, and let me urge this list upon you positively too. One should be humble, for pride goeth before the fall. The meek shall inherit the earth, and blessed are the poor. As for wealth and the rich, it shall be easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. Instead of seeking profit, one should sacrifice and give to charity. Be patient and forgiving. Turn the other cheek. Be aware of one's weaknesses and sins, and be ashamed and self-deprecating as a result of that. Practice self-restraint, particularly with respect to your lower, impure, and often disgusting physical desires. Play it safe. Think of other people's needs first, and don't rock the boat. Realize that we're all dependent upon one another. Obey your parents and your preacher and the politicians. Does the list on the right resonate with you? Do you think that if more people lived that way, they would live better lives and they and the human species would realize its highest potential? Nietzsche is crystal clear about the list on the right. That list is dangerous to human potential. It is a symptom of weakness, even of sickness and unhealthiness. It undermines the human potential for greatness, and it is, tragically, the dominant morality of our time. In our time, all of the traits that ennoble man are condemned, and all of the traits that weaken man are praised. Morality has become, as Nietzsche puts it paradoxically, a bad thing. Morality has become immoral. Precisely morality would be to blame if the highest power and splendor actually possible to the type man was never in fact attained, so that precisely morality was the danger of dangers. Accordingly, Nietzsche concludes, we need a critique of moral values. The value of these values themselves must first be called in question, and for that there is needed a knowledge of the conditions and circumstances in which they grew, under which they evolved and changed. Our problem is this. Somehow the morality of the weak has become dominant, and the morality of the strong has declined. How is this rather paradoxical state of affairs to be explained? Part of the story is individual, a matter of our individual biological and psychological makeups. For each of us individually, either the master morality or the slave morality resonates more deeply. But part of the story is also cultural, for sometimes in a culture the master morality dominates, and sometimes the slave morality dominates. And here Nietzsche says there's a history lesson. Part of the historical story is that the modern world has embraced democracy, and democracy means giving power to the majority. And the majority of people are, shall we say, conformist in their tastes, concerned with what their neighbors think about them, looking forward to retirement when they won't have to do anything, content to sit in their little homes gossiping and griping about their bosses and mothers-in-law. Democracies give power to that sort of person, so we should expect that democratic laws and policies will reflect the tastes and interests of that sort of person. Democracies tailor their policies to the majority, and not to the exceptional few, the radicals, the trailblazers, the uncompromising risk-takers. But Nietzsche believes that the modern movement to democracy is itself an effect of deeper historical causes.
If we reflect again on the elements that were on the right side of the list, the slave morality list, pride goeth before the fall, blessed are the meek, turn the other cheek, then clearly all of those elements come out of the Western religious traditions. Nietzsche is forthrightly blaming the Judeo-Christian moral tradition for the rise of the slave morality. For Nietzsche, there are no essential differences between Jews and Christians. Jesus was a Jew who wanted to reform Judaism, and the ensuing split between Judaism and Christianity is a matter of two variations on the same theme. Jews and Christians share the same roots, the same general approach to morality, and Nietzsche traces the origin of that morality back to a decisive event that occurred early in Jewish history, before the time of Moses. That event was the enslavement of the Jews in Egypt. If we recall our biblical history, the Jews were for a long time a slave people under powerful Egyptian masters. But at the same time, we also know that the Jews found a way to survive their enslavement. And while their former Egyptian masters have long since perished, the Jews have survived, spread across the globe, and found a way to keep their religion and culture alive despite often horrible adversity. How did the Jews do it? Here, Nietzsche says the Jews under slavery asked themselves some very practical and realistic questions about morality. If it is good to survive in this world, then what policies and actions will keep you alive? If you happen to be a slave in this world, then what policies and actions will keep you alive as a slave? What policies and actions, by contrast, are likely to get you killed? And if you are a slave who has children whom you desperately want to survive and see them grow up, then what will you teach your slave children about good behavior to increase their chances of actually doing so? Here, Nietzsche is saying that what is moral is not a matter of supernatural theological commandments that hold for all circumstances timelessly. Instead, what is moral is a matter of real-life practical circumstances, and different practical circumstances will call for different moral strategies. So, if you happen to be a slave, what strategy will be moral for you? That is to say, what morality will actually help you survive? If you are a slave, then you must obey the master. This does not come naturally. All living things, says Nietzsche, desire to express themselves. They want to express their power. So in order to obey the master, you must suppress your natural instinct and train yourself to become obedient. Or to take another example, suppose the master strikes you because you did something wrong. The desire for revenge arises naturally, but again you must suppress that desire and not act on it. You must train yourself and internalize obedience, forgiveness, patience, humility. Slaves who do not do this end up dead. Slaves who are proud, unforgiving, disobedient, impatient don't last long. Slave virtues thus have survival value. Slaves who internalize successfully humility, obedience, forgiveness, patience are the slaves who survive. And if you have children, those are the traits that you will drill into them if you want them to survive. Thus, slave virtues will become across generations cultural values. And so Nietzsche is concluding here that in this early decisive event in Jewish history, slave values became cultural values for the Jewish people. Notice that Nietzsche is saying that humility and obedience and so forth are moral not because some supernatural being commanded them to be so. Morality for Nietzsche has nothing to do with religion. Rather, those traits are moral because of down-to-earth, nitty-gritty, practical, how do I survive in a tough world of power struggles considerations. If you are a slave in such a world, then slave morality is a practical tool of survival. Now, of course, time passes and many people forget where their culture's moral code came from. Or they're passive and they don't think about it very much at all and simply accept the prevailing moral code. And even among slave peoples, there are many people who are sheep-like and don't especially mind being slaves. But others resent it, and here the story Nietzsche tells becomes darker. Some of those Jews who were living under Egyptian masters and later masters historically are human beings with a full human being's desire to live, to grow, and to express who they are. But as slaves, they cannot express it. To be a slave is to be frustrated constantly. And the more energetic and living you are, the greater your frustration.
Such slaves will naturally start to resent their masters, and they will also start to hate themselves for having to do what the master says. How do you feel when your boss tells you to do something that you don't want to do? Do you tell your boss to take this job and shove it? Or do you knuckle under silently and do what he says, all the while resenting it? And if you knuckle under often enough and resent long enough, what does that begin to do to your soul? The pressure builds up. Not only do you start to hate the master, you start to hate yourself for being such a weakling and knuckling under. And that in turn causes unbearable pressure to build up inside, psychologically. And that is when psychologically ugly things start to happen. Nietzsche puts the point this way: the outward discharge was inhibited and turned backward against man himself. Hostility, cruelty, joy in persecuting, in attacking, in change, in destruction, all this turned against the possessors of such instincts. That is the origin of the bad conscience. So if you are one of those who has this bad conscience, how do you console yourself? How do you not descend into a self-destructive rage? How do you channel all of that pent-up energy and frustration in a safe direction that nonetheless lets you feel good about yourself? You cannot take real revenge against the masters. You don't have the strength for that. But what about fantasy revenge? Here Nietzsche asks us to think about priests, those who are not your usual sheep-like followers of a religion, but who are cleverer, who are more ambitious and driven in their religion, and who feel more acutely the internal struggle between the natural animal drive for power and the demands of a morality that has taught them to be selfless and humble. Inside such priests, Nietzsche says, we find the most interesting and disturbing psychological phenomena. Nietzsche puts the point harshly. It is because of their impotence that in them hatred grows to monstrous and uncanny proportions. The truly great haters in world history have always been priests. And what are the priests of the Judeo-Christian tradition constantly talking about? Isn't it one big revenge fantasy? Such priests regularly tell their flock that it is good to be humble, meek, and obedient. But to whom is one to be obedient? Well, of course, one is to be obedient to God, but God is not often around. So in practical terms, being obedient to God means being obedient to God's representatives here on earth. And guess who they are? That is, of course, the priests. So this is one part of the strategy. Form a power base of a large number of people who are your obedient followers. You might not have the quality people on your side, but sometimes having a large quantity of people can be a powerful weapon. Another part of the sermon is to condemn those who are rich, powerful, and assertive, to demand that they give their money away to the poor, that they use their power on behalf of the weak and the sick, that they be like the lion that is to lay down with the lamb and not to eat it for lunch. But what is the point of all of these sermons against the rich and the powerful? Well, part of it is to give a consolation to those in your audience who are poor and weak. It plays on their natural envy of those who are rich and strong, and it gives them a satisfaction at hearing the rich and strong getting a tongue lashing. But the sermon is also meant as a direct weapon against the strong and the powerful, and it is meant to induce in them a sense of guilt and self-doubt about who they are and how they live. The moral sermon is a psychological weapon that the weak use in their battle against the strong, and of course the weak use a psychological weapon because physical weapons are not their forte. The priests never use physical confrontation against the masters, and the masters find it beneath their dignity to fight against an unarmed and to them contemptible enemy. Instead, the priests use morality as their weapon of confrontation. They praise the meek and condemn the strong. Judeo-Christian ethics, Nietzsche says, has waged deadly war against this higher type of man. It has placed all the basic instincts of his type under ban. The Judeo-Christian moral code, Nietzsche concludes, becomes part of their revenge strategy. Its point is to help the weaker survive in a harsh world in which they are often on the receiving end of the big stick. But its point is also to undermine the master type's confidence in themselves, to subdue them and eventually to bring them down so as to exact a spiritual revenge. As evidence of this, Nietzsche reminds us of standard Judeo-Christian rhetoric about how, despite appearances, the poor, the sick, and the meek will triumph in the end.
Their kingdom will come, and God will visit his wrath upon the rich and the powerful. And in a perfect catch, Nietzsche here quotes St. Thomas Aquinas, patron saint of Catholic theology and the most influential Christian philosopher of the last millennium. In order that the bliss of the saints may be more delightful for them, and that they may render more copious thanks to God for it, it is given to them to see perfectly the punishment of the damned. So boiling all of this down to two essential points, Nietzsche believes that the slave morality of the Judeo-Christian tradition is part of a twofold strategy. On the one hand, it is a survival code that enables the weak to band together for mutual support. And more sinisterly, it is part of a revenge and a power play in their ongoing battle against the strong. And in Nietzsche's judgment, there is no serious question about who is winning this age-old battle. An early Christian church father named Tertullian once asked rhetorically, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" In early church history, Christians such as Tertullian were often argued with and even mocked by philosophers coming out of the pagan schools of classical Greek philosophy. The point of Tertullian's reply, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" was that the traditions that came out of Athens and the tradition that came out of Jerusalem were opposed and have nothing to do with one another. They are part of an ongoing battle for dominance of the soul of the Western world. Nietzsche agrees, but he phrases the point differently. Jerusalem is the home of the major Western religious traditions, all of them stemming from Judaism. But instead of Athens, Nietzsche points to Rome as the greatest height the pagan traditions achieved. In Rome, the philosophy and the art of the Greeks combined with the political and military genius of the Romans to create the greatest empire the world had ever seen. So in Nietzsche's reading of history, the great battle for the soul of the Western world is Rome versus Judea. And as evidence of whether Rome or Judea is winning, Nietzsche asks us to consider to whom one kneels down before in Rome today. The Judeo-Christians have taken over Rome, and to use Nietzsche's words, everything visibly is becoming Judaized, Christianized, mobized. The chief slave has for a long time established his camp and planted his flag right in the center of what was the greatest master empire the world had ever seen. All of this is a great moral crisis, Nietzsche urges us to think. For the future development of mankind is at stake. What kind of species do we want to be? In what ways do we want to develop? The moral code we choose will set our course. What most people see as the only morality possible, Judeo-Christian morality, Nietzsche sees as a threat to human development. For that morality damns the traits of assertiveness and egoism and independence and risk-taking that make human development and greatness possible. And that same morality praises smallness and meekness and falling on your knees in shame, all traits that undermine human greatness. Nothing stands more malignantly in the way of mankind's rise and evolution than what in Europe today is called simply morality. So the current dominance of the Judeo-Christian moral code is an unhealthy development that must be overcome. The fate of the human species depends on it. We must go beyond good and evil. Nietzsche once said that he philosophized with a hammer. By that he did not mean anything crude like a sledgehammer that smashes things. He had in mind a delicate hammer, like the one a piano tuner uses to strike keys on a finely built musical instrument, to see which notes are clear and which notes are discordant or muddy. In writing his philosophy, Nietzsche intends for his words to be like that delicate hammer on your soul. When you read them or hear them, how does your soul respond? Does it vibrate clearly, or does it wobble uncertainly? When you hear that God is dead, do those words cause you to shrink inside and fill with a squishy panic? Or do those words strike a clear, pure, liberating note that heralds the beginning of the magnificent symphony you can become? God is dead, so we must become gods ourselves and create a new set of values. Yet, Nietzsche says, most people are afraid to legislate for themselves. They know there is great risk and much inequality out there in the big bad world. So they want a higher power to shoulder the responsibility.
But, Nietzsche says, for some precious few among us, the revelation that God is dead galvanizes every fiber of their being. They respond by feeling passionately and solemnly, I will become the author. I will create. I will accept the responsibility joyously. I will move beyond good and evil and create a new, magnificent set of values. Such an individual will elevate mankind to a higher level of being. He will be the Übermensch, the Superman, or the Overman. The entire history of mankind, Nietzsche believes, will have prepared the Übermensch for his great creative adventure. In himself, he will embody the best of the past. The exuberance and physical vitality of the past masters will flow through his veins. But Nietzsche also credits the Judeo-Christian tradition for its internalized spiritual development by turning all of its energy inward and stressing ruthless self-discipline and self-denial. That tradition has been the vehicle for the creation of a stronger, more capable type of spirit. The new masters will thus combine the physical vitality of the aristocratic masters of old with the spiritual ruthlessness of the slave priests of Christianity. As Nietzsche put it in one memorable phrase, the new masters will be Caesars with the soul of Christ. We cannot say ahead of time what new values the Overman will create. Not being Overmen ourselves, we cannot legislate for him or even predict what he will decide. But Nietzsche does indicate fairly strongly what broad direction he thinks the Overman will take. The Overman will find his deepest instinct and let it be a tyrant. The creative source of the future lies in instinct, passion, will. To put the point negatively, the Overman will not rely too much on reason. Reason, of course, is the favorite tool of modern scientific man, but Nietzsche holds that reason is a tool of weaklings, a superficial, fantasy-creating structure for those who need to feel safe and secure. Instead, Nietzsche believes instinct is the deepest part of your nature. And if you feel you have a strong, powerful instinct deep inside you, you should nurture it and let it dominate, for that is the source of true creativity. One thing is needful: to give style to one's character, a great and rare art. In the end, when the work is finished, it becomes evident how the constraint of a single taste governed and formed everything, large and small. Whether this taste was good or bad is less important than one might suppose, if only it was a single taste. And again, the great man is great owing to the free play and scope of his desires, and to the yet greater power that knows how to press these magnificent monsters into service. Another hint that Nietzsche gives us is that the Overman will accept conflict and exploitation easily, and he will enter the fray eagerly. In the face of conflict, many people are squeamish and given to wishing that life could be kinder and gentler. For such people, Nietzsche has nothing but contempt. People now rave everywhere, even under the guise of science, about the coming conditions of society in which the exploiting character is to be absent. That sounds to my ear as if they promise to invent a mode of life which should refrain from all organic functions. Conflict and exploitation are built into life, and the Overman will not only accept that as a natural fact, he will be a master of conflict and exploitation. As Nietzsche puts it, we think that everything evil, terrible, tyrannical in man, everything in him that is kin to beasts of prey and serpents, serves the enhancement of the species man as much as its opposite does. And further, a higher and more fundamental value for life might have to be ascribed to deception, selfishness, and lust. Another suggestion Nietzsche gives us about the Overman is this: the Overman will accept the natural fact of great inequalities among men and his own superiority. The Overman will have no qualms about his superior abilities and his superior worth to all others. About the superior men, Nietzsche forthrightly exclaims, "Every enhancement of the type man has so far been the work of an aristocratic society, and it will be so again and again. A society that believes in the long order of rank and differences in value between man and man, and that needs slavery in some sense or other. And as the last quotation suggests, Nietzsche indicates approvingly that the overman will have absolutely no problem with using and exploiting ruthlessly others to achieve his ends. Mankind in the mass sacrificed to the prosperity of a single stronger species of man. That would be an advance. Nietzsche gives a name to his anticipated overman. He calls him Zarathustra, and he titles his greatest literary and philosophical work after him. Zarathustra will be the creative tyrant. Having mastered himself and others, he will energetically and exuberantly create a magnificent new reality. Zarathustra will lead mankind beyond themselves and into an open-ended future. Nietzsche longs for Zarathustra's coming. But someday, in a stronger age than this decaying, self-doubting present, he must yet come to us, the redeeming man of great love and contempt, this man of the future who will redeem us not only from the hitherto reigning ideal, but also from that which was bound to grow out of it, the great nausea, the will to nothingness, nihilism. This Antichrist and anti-nihilist, this victor over God and nothingness, he must come one day. And on that prophetic note, Friedrich Nietzsche stops and leaves the future in our hands.